Hi, I'm Natalia Munoz, the news director of Holyoke Media. Today we have with us the professor, Nicole Hendricks, who is also the chair of the Criminal Justice Department at Holyoke Community College. And we're going to be talking about what everybody's talking about across the nation and even outside American borders, is what is happening in police departments across the country. Not all of them. There are 18,000 police departments. In some of them, we're not going to say that every department has a huge problem in dealing with people, but wow, when there are problems, usually it makes national news. And most recently, those 8 minutes that a police officer was on George Floyd's neck, a man who had been handcuffed, had been arrested, handcuffed, and he died. And there have been protests across the country. Professor, what I would like to ask you about is, first of all, what are police officers to be learning in college? What are some of the courses that you teach?
Hi, Natalia. Thank you for having me today. I'm delighted to be here, even though the last few weeks have been very challenging for many of us. Yeah, in terms of police training within the context of higher education, I first want to just make a distinction between programs that offer a degree in, a associate's degree in criminal justice and police training that happens in the academy. So not all folks that even enter into our program become police officers. There's many types of jobs and fields that they might go into. And, across this country, there's some interesting data that tells us that, most police departments, it's roughly 80% only require a high school diploma. So that's sort of first thing to realize, that the requirements for entry across those 18,000 police departments are often only a high school degree. So then when you want to sort of look at who is getting an associate's degree or even a 4-year degree, I'd like to start by giving you some sort of details on that. There's a great study by the Police Foundation that came out in 2017. And so if we look at that group of 18,000, only 1/3 of police officers in the United States have a 4-year degree. And then a little over half have a 2-year degree. And so when they do come to the college campus, and those officers that have gotten some sort of college education, I can really only speak for Holyoke Community College. I've been there about 14 years, and so I have actually been part of adjusting and changing the curriculum over these, this decade plus. And it's really focused on the liberal arts. Our program is housed in the social sciences division. We're not a professional program. We are part of the social sciences, which means that our students take 8 courses of general education, and that means 2 English courses. They take a course on political science. That's sort of either understanding state and local governments or US national government. We require in our program that they take statistics, because we feel it's really important that they are able to have quantitative reasoning skills. We think data is really important and understanding data is really critical. So they are required to take statistics. They take physical science courses. They take sociology and psychology. And then aside from those 8 courses, which are, general education courses, we as a program require 7 classes. And those are really narrower classes that deal with specifics of the criminal legal system. And I use that word intentionally because we feel we're a very progressive and critical program. I've actually, in most of my classes now refer to this as the criminal legal system. And that's because we recognize that we do not see the type of justice that we would hope to operating currently in this system. So that, and we kind of focus on several important elements. So there's sort of an introductory survey course, which is Criminal Justice 100. There's a course on corrections. There's a course on criminology, and that's a course that I teach quite a bit. It's a sociological course that tries to unpack the many reasons that people commit crime, but also, you know, if we think about criminological theory, it offers students an opportunity to interrogate even the notion of criminality and who is framed as criminal and the ways in which race and class and gender and sexual orientation influence who is criminalized in this country. So, you know, criminology is a core course. All students have to take it. They also take criminal law and procedure, which, you know, we have a wonderful new faculty member who has a degree, a law degree and a background in the law. And she, her name is Professor Adina Gianelli. She teaches that course. And then we also have a course called Police and Society. Now, what has changed in the last decade for us is we used to call that course sort of police administration. And we recognized that it really had to shift to do something that I'm sort of calling for in our college. And, you know, when I talk to people about this moment, which is really, what is the role of police in society? What is the function of police? What are we expecting the police to do? Now we can sort of talk about, yeah, go ahead.
Hey, you raised so many important points. I hope I don't forget to ask you questions about all of them, but just starting with what you just said, when students graduate and you know they're gonna go to the next step, which is training to become a police officer or a state police, what do you see mostly? Is it who wants to be a police officer? I mean, do you sometimes see, wait a minute, that person probably doesn't have the temperament to be a police officer? And how do you handle that, if at all? I know it's complicated.
Honestly, in terms of the motivations for students, you know, many students speak about family connection to policing. And so they may have a father, brother, uncle, mother who, you know, worked in law enforcement, and that's why they're interested in serving. We also hear a lot from students that they would like to help and they want to help people. And obviously, that's what we would encourage. You know, one of the courses that we teach that's part of the program is human relations. It's ethics and issues of diversity. And so we spend a lot of time talking about the role of being a public servant. You are serving the public, right? Your job means that we're going to hold you to much higher expectations. And then, of course, you know, we have students who are already working within the criminal legal system who are coming back to school. Now, the question, you know, the tricky question that you asked in terms of, do I ever see students who may not have the temperament? Absolutely. I can think of times when, you know, and this is not a problem that is unique to our students who are majoring in criminal justice, but students who have been dishonest and plagiarized a paper. You know, I have to say, unfortunately, this happens every semester. And my response, you know, and I can speak for only myself, I'm not sure what my colleagues do, but we generally share a pretty firm and strong belief that that's, you know, being honest in your work is a reflection of how you will operate in your life. I say, you know, this kind of behavior really calls into question maybe your fitness for this work. If you're willing to lie on a paper, then you know, it's a slippery slope. And in fact, there's quite a bit of content in my courses that deals, you know, just very directly with that, that talks about the kind of moral and ethical dilemmas that people face and how, you know, police are human beings. You know, they live in this country, which means they have implicit bias, like we all do. But police are given the authority to use deadly force. And so that distinction should not be taken lightly by any of us, and certainly by people who are interested in going into this work. Yeah.
At the same time, This is a field, as we know, that is extremely demanding, extremely stressful. There's a general feeling in society, the police, all they do is give you tickets if you're going too fast, or they don't show up on time. There's sort of this negative feeling, generally speaking, about police that is misplaced. It's just one of those myths that just keep growing. So they're not only dealing with a dangerous job, they're dealing with dangerous myths about themselves, about how
Mhm.
society perceives them. How do they learn to deal with that stress? Not only the stress of the job itself, but the stress of knowing that a lot of people, when they see them, are not necessarily happy to see them unless, of course, they've called them to help alleviate a dangerous situation or situation.
It's a great question, and I appreciate that you've emphasized kind of the double bind that police are in. You know, we've created this system, and I guess I'd like to emphasize that there's an individual sort of officer experience, but I think the much of what has occurred over the last few weeks has shown us that part of the problem is the massive expansion of using police authority to solve many, many, many problems that our political system has kind of abdicated responsibility for. So homelessness, instead of building affordable housing, police are responsible for arresting disorderly people, substance abuse, and we know this to be a problem in our own community. You know, this is something that we've been dealing with for a very long time. Police are often called to deal with those situations. And really, they don't have the tools or the solutions to solve those problems. And so I think there is a much larger systemic issue. And we can talk about police training and police self-image and stress, but the way that we're really going to alleviate some of that is to have a fundamental shift in how we think about safety and the role of police in our communities. And a lot of folks have been talking about this, how we prioritize the spending of resources. Now, will it work to throw a lot more money towards police training? I don't believe so. And calls for reform doesn't necessarily change the fundamental relationship between, you know, what it is we're asking police to do. And so, you know, I think, yes, there's a lot of police stress, and in our system, there is not a lot of attention to mental health, which, you know, this is sort of me just likely compounds the problem, right? If we have police who are stressed, and it's, you know, one of the courses I teach is Women, Crime and Justice, which looks at the gendered nature of a lot of these systems. It's still a male-dominated, predominantly, you know, white male-dominated profession. There has not ever been a lot of attention to mental health and trauma. And so, you know, does that affect behavior? Absolutely. And yet we should do those things. We should offer sort of some kind of mental health intervention or way to help people doing this work de-stress, and also obviously de-escalate. But fundamentally, the nature of the relationship between police and the community has to change.
And how does that change when we talk about reform? For instance, the Northampton police chief integrated the recommendations from a task force, 21st Century Policing, that was put together by a bunch of people that the Obama administration appointed to a task force to look at, okay, what recommendations can we give to police departments across the country? Very few police departments participated in that.
Mm-hmm.
So if there are 18,000, I remember, if I recall correctly, I think the Northampton Police Chief was the first in Massachusetts. And at that time, the Northampton Police Department was one of, I don't know, maybe 24. 18,000 police departments. Is there a resistance to change?
Sure. You know, putting on a sort of different hat, prior to coming to Holyoke Community College, I worked for an organization called the Vera Institute of Justice. And I worked primarily on researching police accountability misconduct. And I was very fortunate to be involved in some research at the federal level, one of which was examining the city of Pittsburgh. They were the first to be placed under a federal consent decree after a pattern and practice of misconduct. And of course, here's this other name of a Black man killed in the suburbs of Pittsburgh, Johnny Gamage. And this was in the late 90s. And, you know, Pittsburgh, the Justice Department was given this power to sue local police departments. And Pittsburgh went under this federal consent decree. And I was part of the team that went in to understand how the consent decree worked. And at the time, there were some very encouraging results. And now that's, you know, using the power of the federal government to force change. That's pretty much, you know, as far as you can go in terms of trying to implement reform. And there were some significant changes, but there's a, you know, before meeting with you, I read a recent New York Times article that says the fix didn't stick. And that's because of changing police leadership. You know, there are all sorts of reasons that these reforms that are kind of like stops and starts, I don't want to sound discouraging, but are just sort of tinkering around the edges of what needs to be honestly a total reimagining of how we use police.
So when you said earlier, you adjust or you change the curriculum, going back to education then.
Sure.
Where so how do you adjust the curriculum given what's been going on? It seems as though there's a cultural shift finally in terms of police officers really need to focus on I guess one of them is there needs to be better vetting. There needs to be psychological help. Psychological help has to be something that they can accept without feeling that they're a lesser human being, or a lesser police officer. And also, you know, de-escalating. So how do you, in this cultural shift where people, that's it, no more, what are the courses that you can teach?
So I should mention, you know, I left out a few courses that we have added just in the last 2 years. And one of them is a sort of capstone course for students who are graduating. It's meant to be a moment of real reflection for students. And I'm the one that teaches it. And so, you know, it is obviously sometimes dependent on who's teaching it. But I use the memoir Just Mercy by Brian Stevenson, which is about racial injustice and the criminal legal system. And I find students really react to it, as everybody does. I mean, it's a moving story, a heartbreaking story about just the many ways in which Black folks and brown folks, but mostly Black folks in this country, experience a brutal, hostile legal system, where, you know, we have this long history of racial terror, and that persists. And so students who read the text, maybe not after this week, but often a lot of the white students express surprise at some of the things they're reading and disbelief that these types of things are still happening. But it offers a semester-long, you know, real deep dive into the way race has shaped our criminal legal system, not the way that race is sort of impacted by decisions in the criminal legal system, but that actually the foundation of the whole system is racialized, and essentially, you know, comes from, as you may be aware, you know, Black codes, the enforcement of forcing labor. You know, there's when we read this text, it allows us to have those conversations. And then I think it also means being very intentional about the kinds of reflective assignments that you're asking students to engage in. Yeah.
You said that earlier, that not all police departments require police officers to have a college education.
Right.
That graduating from high school is enough.
Mm-hmm.
Why is that?
This is, again, something that we've been struggling with for decades. So in the 1970s, there was a real push to professionalize policing. And that came after similar moments in our history of great unrest and rebellion and just, brutal attacks on civilians. And so there was a commission, and one of the recommendations was to create criminal justice programs. But some of the backlash, I wouldn't say that, maybe the word is not backlash, but some of the concern around requiring a degree is that they just simply wouldn't have enough people who could meet that requirement. And I am somewhat understanding of the question of, it's a multifaceted problem, access to education. Let's remember that many of our folks of color and people in first-generation families cannot afford a college education. And so would that further limit kind of the number and scope of people who could do the job? I will say, before talking with you, I looked at some of our data, which has really shifted. In the fall, this fall, we had 256 majors in the program. And in a 10-year period, so in 2010, only 37% of our students were students of color. And now that number is 50%. So we've seen actually this dramatic increase in students of color who want to go into the criminal justice field, which is kind of surprising given this moment, right?
Well, also, when you mentioned, yes, access to education, and yes, that is absolutely true. Not everybody, most people don't have access to education.
Mm-hmm.
And yet, when I think of, wait a minute, you're going to become a police officer, you're going to have a gun, you're going to have a taser, you're going to basically decide whether somebody can go home or goes to jail,
Mm-hmm.
or lives or dies.
Yep.
There's just so much going on there. And this is not to say that every police officer is an executioner. That's not how I meant it.
Mm-hmm.
I just meant it in the sense of such huge responsibility.
Yeah.
I would think that you would want to take some courses, some of the courses that you mentioned earlier in the program. You would want to have a more expansive view of society and American history and, communities, and how the very same situation is seen differently by different people based on their experiences. And what you said earlier, yes, we all have biases.
Mm-hmm.
Someone mentioned to me, who was giving a course on biases, actually, there are people who think like a little old white lady in a Prius, you may think, totally harmless. Well, we don't know that. That's our bias. She could be, just a very dangerous little old lady. So, I mean, it's even that. It's like just to not make assumptions. And I wonder, go ahead.
No, I continue. That's right.
And I wonder, when there is violence by the police officers against Black people, against brown people, I wonder if there's any data that shows what their preparation was to become a police officer. What did they study? Apart from their training on how to put handcuffs on people and how to, arrest people or whatever. Do you know of any study that looks at?
So now you've hit a really hot button issue. So, the fact is, we don't even have reliable data on how many people are facing police violence. We do not collect that. And, as I mentioned before, as a person who comes from a research background, one of the things that has always been very difficult is that we keep data on a lot of things, but there's a real gap in our understanding. And so I am not aware. I'm not sure. I haven't read recently, all the data on police training, but I'm not sure we could be able, we could answer that. Like, what kind of training did this particular person get? We can see, a broad brush that the types of training once, so sort of the first thing, let me just back up. The first thing is, we started by saying, 80% of police departments in this country, that's 18,000, only require a high school diploma. I will say in Massachusetts, Massachusetts has the highest level of college education among police officers in the country. So I think I have some data on this. I looked at this, right. So Massachusetts, the 49% have 4-year degrees or higher. And that's pretty surprising, given what we see in other parts of the country. Go ahead.
Earlier you said that should we put more money in policing? And what was your answer?
My answer is, this is a tough one, obviously, because I teach in a criminal justice program, but really there's a wonderful book that has gotten quite a bit of press in the last couple of days. It's called The End of Policing by Alex Vitale. And he makes a very compelling argument. He sort of goes through the list of the types of reforms and changes that we have tried over 100 years. But he highlights that in the last 40 years, we have seen, and I think this is undeniable, a massive expansion of police authority and a militarization, right? So we see more aggressive policing. So these moments, these examples of police violence should not really be a surprise to any of us, because the trend has been that we have expanded police authority. We have abdicated our responsibility for dealing with larger social problems like mental health, housing insecurity, substance abuse. And at the same time, we've said, here, give police excess military equipment, give them training on, sort of tactical things rather than some of the things that we're describing, which is a deep kind of critical analysis of the society. So, he kind of says we should shift some of these resources. I'm not sure that giving more money to the types of training that is much more focused on the tactical element of policing rather than as we're saying right now, a liberal arts kind of more broad-based education. He talks a lot about restorative justice, harm reduction models. I know we're familiar with that in our own community, but he really says to sort of pose this important question: what do communities need to be safe? Do they always need the police to be safe? If we invested in dealing with some of these entrenched problems in our communities, which don't come from the people themselves, I would argue, but come from a divestment of resources in often Black and brown communities, post-industrial communities like Holyoke. If we actually invested money in education, in our education system, in all of these places, how could we think about safety differently?
Isn't that it kind of like, or it reminds me of, there's this whole climate change movement. We got to get away from the fossil fuels, from gas and oil, but we need something until we get there. Mm-hmm. So until we get there, we have gas and oil and nuclear power plants. Is it similar, like until we get to a new thinking of how to police and what you all teach students? It's like, what's the in between? What's the bridge between what is now and what we really need in the future?
You're absolutely right, Natalia. I think that is the sort of mental leap that we have to take. And I taught a course this semester. It was a learning community, actually, and there were criminal justice students in this course about prison abolition, which is a very kind of, for some people, radical notion. We use the work of Ruth Gilmore and Angela Davis. And the first question that students ask is, well, that's crazy to think that we wouldn't use incarceration. We have to punish people. But part of the argument is that it's important to have that vision in the movement, right? To have this way of reimagining how we can operate in communities. But I'm also not naive to the notion that there is a middle period. And so these things that we've been discussing this morning are an essential part of, getting there. There are some folks who say, as long as you're only focused on reform, you'll always be just reforming and you'll never sort of get to a healthier, safer community. But I think that education has to be a part of it. I was part of a statewide group through the Department of Higher Ed. And one of the one of the recommendations that they have made, which, of course, our police agencies don't necessarily have to take, is requiring a 2 or 4 year degree. So it's not that those recommendations are not out there. They're out there coming from statewide policymakers. Maybe this is a moment to move in that direction. I would also say that, it can't just be laid at the foot of educators. There are legislative changes that have to be made by way of police accountability within our cities and towns. And so civilian review boards have always been a part of the conversation. I know that unions, police unions have been very often not thrilled about the idea of civilian review boards, but I think that is on the table. There are police departments in our area that, I can think of Pittsfield, for example. They have a civilian review board. They also have like mobile mental health units. So it's not that there aren't departments or agencies that are unwilling to partner with their communities and to try to create systems that are more fair and more equitable. We should learn from them.
Recently on Netflix, I watched a series called The Valhalla Murders. It's based in Iceland. And what was interesting is that at one point a police officer needs a gun. She has to phone in her headquarters, her station, and ask for the code so then she can punch the code into the safe box that's in the car so she can take out the gun. And that just blew me away. I mean, that's real. I mean, I don't think that would, I mean, if this was ever proposed here, I think, it just wouldn't go anywhere. But I just thought, wow, that's a real different way of looking at having a weapon on you, that you have to really think about, you have to think, and you have to make a phone call, and you got to say, it really slows you down. And I wonder how many people's lives could be saved doing something like that. But on the other hand, I can also see where people could get hurt because, it's easy to fumble and when you're under a lot of extreme stress. What do you think?
Well, and I would say to you, though, what is the political and economic system in Iceland?
Yeah, no, I know it's different. Right.
In terms of the level of violence that they would be likely to encounter in the first place, and the way, and again, I hate to sound like a broken record, but are needs being met in part, certainly not across, I don't know enough about Iceland, but in many Scandinavian countries, there is just a basic level of needs that are met. And so we don't necessarily see the policing of certain kinds of behaviors and decisions, difficult decisions that people have to make. They're not waging a war on drugs like we have been for the last, many decades. And so in the absence of some of those elements, within a community, police can behave differently because they're not being tasked with a warrior mentality of, drug interdiction, and they're not doing those things.
Right, but as you know, and so many of these deaths these killings have been just of innocent people, or they weren't tried and convicted and found guilty.
Almost none of them were tried and convicted.
Right. Yeah. So it's what's broken in the system then, you as an educator, that there are just some police officers who just apparently explode, and then somebody ends up being dead, and usually it's a Black person, a brown person.
Well, I mean, I think that, as I said earlier, policing is an institution embedded in a much larger system that is marked by white supremacy, patriarchy, and economic inequality. And
But when you
so,
say things like that, and when you say, but can colleges teach that then? You know, what would happen if you taught a course on white supremacy and the system?
well, I mean, some of our courses do really focus on that. So we do that. I mean, I teach several courses where that is definitely a part of the dialogue. And so, you know, I think that again, you know, there's so many moving parts in terms of how do we know which police officers are getting this kind of educational experience? And then what happens once they're part of a police department? They may get all kinds of training and education, you know, or they may have gone through a 4-year or 2-year program. But then, you know, the realities of being on the job and the pressures of being on the job in terms of the culture within departments is not something that we would then have any control over, right? So I think that, you know, let me back up. How do you identify truly, you know, racist or problem officers? There are mechanisms for doing that. You know, I mentioned Pittsburgh. You know, one of the things that they implemented was something called an early warning system, which tracked use of force, any kind of use of force, any kind of police stop, and was able to identify, you know, problem officers ahead of time. There are kind of initiatives like that. They're not widely used, and there's some debate about their efficacy, but we have to have some way to introduce greater oversight and transparency and accountability across all of these 18,000.
Our neighbors at Northampton, the police chief, Jody Casper, instituted this transparency program where you can go to the police department's website and you see, not by name, but incident reports that have demographic information. The age of the person, the race, the ethnicity, was force used, what kind of force, why was the force used, what were the injuries sustained. And that's a way for her to track, it sounds a little bit like Pittsburgh, of how the police officers are carrying out their duties. And if there's a trend, she'll see it. Should there be like federal, not guidelines, but federal regulations over the 18,000 police departments, whether it's a 3-person police department or a giant one? I don't know, I think New York City has like 26,000 officers. Should there be something that these are the basic courses you have to take, and every year you need to stay up, not just on, you know, shooting straight, but also on knowledge, on the changing social mores? Would that be helpful?
Sure. Possibly. I mean, this is something that, you know, has been kicked around for decades, and it comes up against the same kinds of conversations we have anytime we think about the United States, you know, the difference between sort of states' rights and local control over agencies versus a federal sort of standard or mandate. And so I think there's always a lot of pushback around one size fits all model. I will say that around the issue of data, we certainly need to have a better sense of what is happening. We do collect federal data on policing in the form of the Uniform Crime Report and something called NIBRS, as well as the National Crime Victimization Survey. And those are, you know, they have quite a bit of information in them, but there's also quite a bit of a lag in terms of when that data is readily available. As I mentioned before, we don't have a national kind of clearinghouse on police violence. And we don't have national data on gun violence either, right? And so those are things that seem to me, in a sort of 21st century society with all of the sort of tech that we have in this country, that we should be able to collect quite a bit more information about what is happening and what is going on that would aid transparency and accountability. Setting national standards, I may have an opinion about that. I'm not sure, sort of the political feasibility of it. Partly because people think their town is so unique and their issues are so unique that, it shouldn't apply.
Yeah, we're all very special.
Right.
I'm hearing a couple of things at the same time. On one hand, say at Holyoke Community College, the Criminal Justice Department can be flexible. It can calibrate its curriculum.
Sure.
And it can become more progressive, more responsive to the realities of our society. But at the same time, police departments across the country are becoming more militarized. Mm-hmm. So it seems like there's a collision there, no? How does one address that?
So, yes, I think that we feel we can only, sort of change what we can change in our orbit. And, we have an amazing committed group of faculty and a division that has supported us. And, quite frankly, the state of Massachusetts has done quite a bit to align the curriculum and make important changes. Massachusetts had something called the Quinn Bill, which you may have heard of, which was giving incentive pay to police to go to college. And so, that was something that was in effect for quite a while, up until 2009. In fact, the city of Holyoke still pays about $800,000, last I heard, a year to officers. There were about 68 Holyoke police officers in 2017 who were receiving incentive pay because they have a college degree. And so, in this state, we do seem to encourage and support education, and we've moved in that direction. I feel pretty confident about a lot of the students that I have had the pleasure to work with, but we don't have control over then that next step in terms of what happens within a policing agency. I'd like to say, I keep in touch with a lot of my former students, and I'm always really heartened by kind of their takeaways after 10 years of being, in a class with me. They often reflect on the things that we're talking about today. But I can't really, aside from maybe talking with you right now, have the kind of impact on those things that are really driven by federal decisions, statewide decisions.
Okay, last question, and
Sure.
Thank you so much for your time. How long, how soon, how much more do we have to wait until this climate of terror by very few minority of police officers is eliminated from departments nationwide?
Natalia, that's
the one who knows the question.
That's a very that's
you
a very
study, but you study this, and you've seen trends, and you've been doing this for many years. So, are we getting closer? Are we still far away?
I think we're far away. I think that so I'm a white presenting person of color. I'm actually I'm a biracial person. My father is African American, and so I reflect on how this has impacted just my ancestral history. There are folks in my family who were lynched. This is a continuous thread and not really a disruption in my mind. The threat of racial violence has persisted. And so, you know, my real heartfelt, honest reaction right now is I don't have a lot of high expectations for what's going to happen immediately right now. I don't see a lot of indications, certainly from federal leadership, that this will move things in the right direction. I do have a lot of high expectations for the students that I work with. So my small world at Holyoke Community College, you know, I do gain quite a bit of strength and hope and encouragement from the wonderful students who I have the pleasure of working with and from my colleagues. And so that's kind of what gets me moving forward. I wish I could answer that differently. But, you know, in this moment, you know, I think we need to kind of sit with the weight of what is happening, and maybe not be so surprised. I hope we're awakened, but I hope we realize that this is not an anomaly. And so it's going to take many more people kind of coming to terms with our history to make the kinds of personal and then collective changes that have to happen.